I'll take it, Marshall. I was inspired by Ruth, and a little bit in terms of, I've realized I didn't necessarily get the passion in my talk. So I want to do a couple things just to get going here. So I was born in a town of 500 people at 6,500 feet elevation in a town called Heber City, and it was a mining town. And so I'm going to maybe make a distinction between historical academics call the thinking-doing gap. I come from a place where there's no thinking, it's all doing. And so it's interesting, my presence in an academic situation has always made me feel very, very awkward because I'm a doer. So by the time I was 24 years old, I had done 2 startups, both of them failed. So when I went to the literature on innovation and entrepreneurship, all that thinking was completely useless. It didn't make any sense to me, it wasn't helpful to me. So I started my undergraduate education as a 25-year-old. So I studied philosophy, pretty heavy on the thinking, and then anthropology to kind of keep me grounded. So essentially I became, a fancy term, I'm a practice theorist. So I look at actually what people do to understand what's going on. And so in some ways that's the passion I bring to everything, and I think my colleagues in the room have to deal with that, is because in some ways I want to experiment, I want to try, I want to do. Yes, we have some ideas, but we have to just keep moving, right? And that's basically comes down, I was born in 1962, and the community I came from had been uninhabited 100 years prior. Those are the kind of people I come from. So that's my passion, which keeps me going. So what I'm going to say here is a little bit about, and I got to stay on time, don't I? Although I'll take a little extra time. Is we've had the opportunity, so I'm going to begin with a very provocative question. If Frances is still online, she can also relate to this. So here's my provocative question. Is a high quality graduate education artificially scarce in the US and worldwide? So I want you to sink in with that a little bit. And if so, how might we address this? So we've heard some suggestions here. So the first thing we typically do is we start by putting it online. And so we make it more accessible. The next thing we do is we may lower the price, 50%, 80%. That should make it more accessible. But there's one remaining thing, because that's not terribly innovative, right? Put it online, lower the price. Some other species can do those things. So the last thing, but the hardest thing, is how do we fundamentally change the product, the process? Which means you have to go at the heart of education, which is a really hard thing to do. So what would this look like? I'm a doer, so let me tell you what it looks like. And there's a lot of people in this room who participate in that. Okay, so over 3 years ago, the BUQuestrom School of Business had the opportunity to reimagine graduate education to address this artificial scarcity. So first of all, we put it online. We wanted to make it available across all 24 time zones on the planet. On a daily basis, we touched 22 time zones. Second, we decreased the price by $80,000. So from $110,000 to $24,000. So this allows us to give it to people who are very different and also live in very different types of circumstances: age, race, place, context, circumstances. And of course, the last thing of all, we decided to put 400 to 500 students in a single classroom. That basically means you've got to fundamentally think different about what you're doing. This program launched in August of 2020. We currently have 1,800 students enrolled. We've graduated 600, and we have a retention rate of 95%. So I want to tell you about how we got there, but the other thing I want to say is I did become a thinker with a lot of you in the room. And so AMBA is essentially a lot of research that we use as in the thinking-doing space to bring together to kind of address this problem. So the first thing we did was we said, we need to focus on not the academic definition of the problem, we need to focus on the business problem as it exists in reality. So we went out and interviewed the leader managers and identified what those were. So this kind of takes a kind of a playbook out of open innovation. You don't grab the problem as defined by the experts inside the firm, you go out there and let them define it. So that became our primary starting point in what we did. The next thing we did is, the question is, how do we use, if we got 500 people in a classroom, how do we use that not just a volume problem, darn it, how am I going to deal with these 500 people? How do we think about these 500 people as actually participants in the educational process? So we started our question of, how do we make this a peer-to-peer kind of experience? And so this became the question of, and we'll get back to our fun fancy terms, around network effects. What's a learning network effect? And if it's fundamentally emergent, how do you create a fertile ground for it to grow and those lights to pop on, right? So instead of the faculty controlling all that, how do we allow this stuff to emerge? So that became, and then the third thing we need to do, and this is kind of a playbook out of a digital transformation, is how do we take all those services, the curriculum, all the technologies, and bundle those together so we get to the end user where they are, when they need it, how they need it. Because that's typically also how we're not organized in an educational setting. So those become kind of the three pillars that we went into the foray. But if I kind of think about this as a kind of a learning network at scale, that could be maybe a byline, if we chose that right now, a learning network at scale. Again, how do we make it light up? And this gets interesting, the question. So I'm going to be using the word teacher, faculty, teaching team a little bit interdependently. But if I believe in open innovation, I basically have to distrust the experts, right? Right? So how do I go about this activity? So let me tell you a little bit how we went about the activity. So what we did is we reimagined the role of teaching and what it takes to advance learning in 3 successive stages in a given weekly architecture. So that specific, that direct, that deliberate. So let me tell you about the first part of the week. The first part of the week is the teaching team are still the experts. But the question is, what are they doing? They're basically teaching what's the common language and the common methods that we're going to use to attack that business problem. And they're going to spread that out through asynchronous videos, text, the stuff that we typically know, right? So in some ways, how do I get the knowledge? And again, it's not just knowledge about branding, right? It's knowledge of what's the common language of branding? What are the methodologies we use to solve the branding problem? So it's a different framing of the question. So that's the first part of the week. The second part of the week is what we call live, which I was doing today. This is where we have, to grab the globe, we have a 7 to 9 a.m. and we have a 8 to 10 p.m. live broadcast. So this is how we grab the planet with these things. The purpose of the live session is driven by the teaching team is to ensure the application and the mastery, as best we can, of this common language and these shared methods. So you could use a debate room, you could use a simulation, you could use any variety of things to assess their ability to apply and to master that material. Then here starts to be a little bit more with the magic, the emergent stuff. Is the last half of the week, I refer to this instead of expert and then the facilitation as the orchestration. So the teaching team becomes as orchestrator. So here they simply ask simple questions that get them to essentially what? To share their problems that relate to the problem of branding or the problem of supply chain or whatever the problem of that particular week happens to be. So they start to share their problems. And then the place where that happens, that may be in a team context around a capstone project. They're doing the automotive industry right now. How does that play out there? Or we also leverage a collaborative networking tool called YellowDig, because the thing in the context of YellowDig is if everybody speaks the same common language and they speak the same methods, anybody can talk to anybody about their problem. So instead of having one case study per week, 14 case studies, how many case studies do I have a week? Countless, endless. So this is where we begin. What's the artificial constraint on learning? In some ways, our traditional notion of teaching, we have to get out of the way. We tend to be part of the challenge when it comes like this. And so this is the kind of the odyssey that we have been on as a school and the people involved. But as you can tell, I'm passionate about doing things. I'm passionate about, so if I think about, all my stuff around knowledge creation, knowledge development, that's in there. Stuff around open innovation with people in this room who study that, people around digital transformation who collectively we study. This is all about applying everything that we know. I remember I gave a talk in Montreal in 2017 before we knew our industry was being turned upside down. And the title of the talk was essentially, Physician, Heal Thyself. We talk, and we talk, but we don't do, and we don't do, we don't do. So to me, it fits my passion of living in a small town. It fits my passion of trying to bring what I do, and it's also about finding colleagues who you can, because you can't do this by yourself. So with those, we'll see what questions.
Thanks.
It's a nice podium. I should have used it.
Well, you're sage up on stage, of course, so we'll try to make sure that happens. All right, so we have a couple of questions for you, especially given what's happening today. We see so much going on with artificial intelligence and virtual reality entering into this space. So what role do you see AI and VR in playing in higher education, in democratizing education, in displacing graduate education?
So I'm not terribly worried about it. I see, let's use the word of the day, ChatGPT, right? Let's just use that word for the day and we'll get there. ChatGPT for me is essentially a tireless assistant. Just like what we did automation for cars, it's the same thing. So right now I have my students looking at 10 different companies who cross the spectrum ecosystem of the automobile industry, right? So Toyota to Lyft to Tesla to Geely, et cetera, et cetera. They have to spend a lot of what time, right? Understanding what these car companies are about, what they do. And we don't spend a lot, because I sometimes separate the world as what knowledge, how knowledge, and why knowledge. And so the question there is, how do we learn to embrace that tool so we can make the what part easy for them to gather? So we can spend on, because now we get to execution, right? We get to why, what's the value? How could I do it differently? Because then the innovation questions become more. So in some ways, our educational process, we're just like shoveling what at them all the time, right? We're just shoveling, because we're good at that. And we know more than they do. So the question becomes one is, if you have a tool like this, we have to up our game. We have to kind of go at that how level and that why level. And I think we're just going to get a lot. And if we go to, back to Francis, you want to unleash that, right? That's what you want to unleash, is our ability to execute faster, have our value system encode into what we should and shouldn't do based on the why question. So that's the way I moved around that pesky question.
So you're going to have, well, you get two more questions. I'll give you one I know the answer to, which is, was this in response to COVID? And I know you did this before COVID, especially with edX. Yeah. So I'm going to ask the next one, what was your biggest surprise and hardest challenge in doing this? And you got 30 seconds.
The most recent thing, or I'm just curious?
In launching the online MBA.
I mean, I have colleagues here who could probably suggest something. I think it comes in waves. I mean, like with any disruption, it's different waves. And so I think about it, there's the first foothill was probably, right, faculty to think differently. That was the first foothill, fairly large foothill. And then it was probably pulling together a team of, learning designers during COVID to try to climb that mountain. But now we have a business model and it works. But we're surrounded by institutions who don't fundamentally understand that business model. And so the mountain just got bigger. And so I think that's maybe how I'd characterize, it seems to come in waves, but the mountains get bigger because in some ways you have both less control, but more stuff you have to influence. And the means by which you do that influence, you have to conjure it, right? You have to find it. You have to find like-minded people. You have to find people who will follow you or you follow them, right? Because sometimes we clearly don't do this alone. All right,
thanks, Marshall, so much.